morning, everyone. Good to see a good crowd this morning. We never know what the day will bring. Maybe the rain and the fog is a blessing. It brought a few of you in. So my pleasure to introduce our Collections and Exhibits Manager, Noah Burris, and he's going to talk to us this morning about rural free delivery. And I know you guys have already been asking questions, and he says you'll find out. So let's get to the answers to those questions. Thanks, Noah.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody. So yes, I will be talking about rural free delivery, or RFD, today. So the reason I kind of landed on this topic is when we set up our post office exhibit here on the first floor last year, one of the topics we covered was RFD. So I thought I'd dive into it a little bit deeper and present it here at a coffee talk. So just to start, a little timeline of the post office. So in 1775, the Post Office of the United States was founded by the Second Continental Congress. So they started pretty early with that. In 1792, the Postal Service Act created the Post Office Department. In 1863, free city delivery began. So if you lived in a city, you got your mail delivered free. And it didn't become free for rural residents until 1896. So they had a 33-year gap there where they were not getting free mail delivery, even though city residents were. So the beginnings of it were, it was first proposed in 1891. And in 1890, 65% of the US population lived in rural areas. And rural residents still had to go into town to pick up their mail. So, they wouldn't get it as often as city residents. They'd probably wait, maybe once a week they'd go in. They wouldn't even know if there'd be mail waiting for them when they went in. They'd probably try and time it up, with going in to buy supplies and stuff like that. But they paid the same postage as city residents. So they weren't very happy, that they didn't get the free delivery, city residents did, but they paid the exact same postage. So there were multiple organizations that were proponents of rural free delivery. So the National Grange, the National Farmers Congress, and the State Farmers Alliance, as well as numerous newspaper publishers, tried to get rural free delivery enacted because they thought it would benefit farmers, rural people to be able to stay up to date on the news and get their mail more often and sooner than they were previously. Some concerns of other people that thought it wouldn't be able to enact it was that it would be too expensive. Some senators were even concerned that it would bankrupt the entire country to implement rural free delivery. Postmasters in small areas feared they would lose their jobs because they'd get kind of rolled into bigger post offices and you'd have rural routes then, so you wouldn't need the smaller postmasters. And also merchants in towns feared that they would lose business because farmers would be coming in less often to get their mail. Not to mention, a lot of the small town postmasters ran the post office out of, say, their general store. So they had the farmer come in to get their mail, they'd buy something while they're at the general store. So those were some big concerns as to why people didn't want rural free delivery enacted. But in 1891, Postmaster General John Wanamaker, who was a supporter of it, proposed free rural delivery to customers. He said that it made business logic for the post office to do it that way, and also he believed as a social philosophy it was a benefit to the country to get rural residents their mail sooner and connect them with news and the country and friends and relatives. Opponents of his said that he was just looking to build a customer base for a mail order service for his family's department store, Wanamaker's. The main headquarters was in Philadelphia, a big department store back then. So some people kind of had a cynical view of his support, that he was just using it for his family's own benefit. In 1892, a bill to extend the free delivery system of mails to rural communities was introduced in Congress. The House Committee on Post Office and Post Roads rejected it based on the $6 million price tag. So they thought it was too expensive, didn't recommend it to move forward in the House. They also rejected an amendment lowering it to a $100,000 cost. They still thought that was too high. So Grover Cleveland then became president. And actually in 1893, a bill was passed to appropriate $10,000 for experimental rural delivery, and the postmaster at that point, General Wilson S. Burris, did not move forward with it because he wanted to focus on other concerns. He also claimed it would cost $20 million to enact, but that was later determined that he just threw that out as a guess and he really wasn't basing it on anything. And he said that they could solve the problem of rural delivery by just creating new post offices in rural areas. And that was kind of his fix. So Grover Cleveland was president at that time, and he also thought that he believed it was a crazy scheme to try and enact rural free delivery. So it kind of went by the wayside for a little bit there. But soon after that, a new postmaster was put in charge, and he viewed it as possible, but didn't necessarily think it was the most practical. But he was willing to try it if Congress appropriated money again to try the experiment. And that was Postmaster William Wilson. So in 1895, Congress did appropriate $20,000, and in 1896, they appropriated another $10,000 to begin an experiment of rural-free delivery. So on October 1st, 1896, service finally began, and it started in West Virginia, in Charlestown, West Virginia, Halltown, and Uvilla, West Virginia. And what I think is probably not a coincidence, that was Postmaster General Wilson's home state. So in the first year, it expanded to 44 routes in 29 states. And actually, within about 6 months, April 1st, 1897, they had already expanded it to Hope, Indiana, Clarksville, Arkansas, China Grove, North Carolina, Tempe, Arizona, and Brunswick, Maine, as well as North Yakima, Washington. So they kind of picked different spots throughout the country to experiment in other locations to see how plausible it was. In 1899, they went to a county-wide experiment in Carroll County, Maryland. So that is a map from the National Postal Museum of Carroll County in Maryland, and they tried doing rural-free delivery for an entire county. Before that, it was just, they picked the couple small towns and did a route there. So they did a 6-year experiment to see if it would be successful. The department spent that time evaluating how successful it was. In that 6-year period, they got 10,000 petitions for rural routes, so it was very popular with the general public wanting to get rural-free delivery. And the department evaluated multiple things in that 6-year period: the extent to which RFD could replace fourth-class post offices and contracted routes where they had hired people to deliver mail, whether it could be used to offer services such as money orders, so if they could combine other things involved so they weren't just delivering mail but also doing other services, and also what national RFD would cost. So I wasn't able to find how well they answered those questions, but they did deem it as a success, and it became a permanent service on July 1st, 1902. In 1906, they dropped free off the name because they thought by then enough people realized that it was just like city delivery that it came to them free. So postal inspectors is kind of how routes were formed. So initially, local people would get petitions of 100 local residents' signatures, and they would forward that petition to their representative in Congress. The congressmen would then have to approve it, and move it to the post office department, where they would then send a postal inspector, or what they gave them as temporary duty special agents, and they would go out to all these rural areas and determine how practical it was to design a rural route. So they used numerous factors in making their decision. So they tried to create routes that you did not use the same road twice in a day, the rural carrier. It could serve 100 families over 25 miles, and it had to have passable roads all year long. So that was a big one for the post office. You had to be able to have their rural carrier get down the road and out of there. So the postal inspector would send their notes and the route map back to Washington, D.C. and the post office, and the headquarters of the post office would make the final decision on where routes were made. So they were often popular visits when postal inspectors came into areas. You'd see a lot of townspeople, even from other area towns, that would come and meet with the postmaster. You'd see community leaders would come and meet with inspector would come and meet with the inspector to try and get them to convince them that their town should be included or their area should be included on the rural route. And you would also see the newspapers would often report when postal inspectors were in town. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when this was all happening, the post office department had a lot of political patronage. So part of the problem they ran into is that the party in power would often put in place friends of theirs into positions of power in the post office. And so superiors in DC would often push for certain routes that would benefit their political friends. So it was like a thank you to them for supporting them in their political career, so they would give them the rural route. The inspectors would then inspect the route 2 times a year once it was approved and put in place. So they would inspect the carriers, the mailboxes, and make sure the roads met specifications. And so there is a U.S. Post Office inspector badge from around 1900, and that is also from the National Postal Museum. Rural carriers, so when they went out to try and hire these rural carriers after they implemented all these routes, they told local post offices to look for people of the highest moral quality, neat and tidy, and not prone to bouts of drinking. They wanted them to be reliable and trustworthy by the people that they would be delivering their mail to. They were not required to wear uniforms, but many of them would purchase badges or other patches to put on their hat or their jacket, and that is one there on the page there, also from the National Postal Museum, of Rural Free Delivery Route 5. So someone would have purchased that patch to put on their hat or jacket so people could see what route they served and that they were the rural carrier. They were required to purchase and operate and maintain their own transportation. So one of the problems when rural routes first came into existence is they had to have a form of transportation, right? So maybe you had a horse and a wagon. A lot of people used that to begin with. You started to see other companies start to make wagons specifically designed for rural carriers to deliver the mail. Then you had other companies start making wagons that met specifications that the post office department put out to recommend for wagons. So you kind of saw some new businesses creep up from rural carriers. So not only did you have to buy and require your own transportation, but then think if you had the horse, you had to buy the feed for the horse, supplies, vet costs, repairs. So it was kind of an expensive endeavor for people to get into the rural carrier profession. So in 1897, the annual salary for a rural carrier was $300, which was actually $500 less than city carriers. So if you think of all the upfront costs they had to start to, wasn't the most lucrative career for them. A lot of them in the early days would supplement their income by selling other goods or services on their route. And that was actually initially encouraged by the post office that, hey, you can, sell this item while you're going on your route. You can offer to bring them certain supplies from town for money, just to make extra money. Eventually, though, it was banned by the post office, and they said it was to keep routes moving quickly and efficiently because people were getting bogged down doing all these side jobs for extra money. Also, in the early days, a lot of times, not even for money, but they would show up at a farm and, the resident would ask them for help with an animal or a piece of equipment or something just because they often don't see people out at their house. So now that I've got somebody here, hey, can you help me with this? They served as traveling post offices. So like I mentioned earlier, when they were trying to evaluate what else they could do then besides just delivering the mail, they also sold stamps and money orders and registered letters. So they could kind of be your one-stop post office out in the country, so you didn't have to go into town for really anything to do with the post office. They served rural and suburban areas, so you had some suburban spots that hadn't been annexed by city post offices yet that they would serve on their route. And in 1902, there were 8,500 rural carriers in the United States. So originally, the post office by law could only deliver packages up to 4 pounds. So that included city deliverers and rural deliverers. And anything over that was shipped by private express companies. So the post office in the early mid-1900s started asking Congress if they could experiment with delivering heavier packages. They allowed them to. And on January 1st, 1913, parcel post service began, and that allowed them first to deliver up to 13 pounds, then that increased from 13 pounds to 20 pounds, and then shortly after that increased from 20 pounds to 50 pounds. So they still couldn't do super heavy stuff, but it did kind of grow the weight of packages they could deliver. And in the first 6 months, they delivered 300 million packages. So very successful. People were happy with the service. It was popular in cities as well. I know in one city, I believe it was Chicago, there was a business that they actually delivered business people their lunch through the mail. So they capitalized on that. And it also led to the manufacturing of special packaging. A number of different shipment boxes were created by various companies to ship farmer products, including eggs, butter, and vegetables. And so that is a metal egg crate that would have been used to ship eggs through the mail. So in Minnesota, rural free delivery, the first route was established out of the Farmington Post Office on January 1st, 1897. In Pipestone County, Woodstock on September 1st, 1900 established a rural route. Pipestone on November 1st, 1902. Edgerton on February 1st, 1904. And Ruthven on August 15th, 1904. And so those are the towns that the post office had records of when they established rural routes out of their post office here in Pipestone County. So we have a little bit of information on a few rural carriers from Pipestone County. So we didn't have much information on him, but here's Mr. Fink in his car that he delivered mail in, and he was a rural carrier out of Edgerton. Then we had Henry Petchow. He was a rural mail carrier for 30 years. He operated Route 6 out of Pipestone. He served as the director of the Rural Mail Carriers Association and also the president of the Federation of Rural Letter Carriers. So he was very involved in different organizations he could join as a rural carrier. And there he is standing in front of his horse and wagon. It says RFD, route number 6 there, US Mail. And here we have a picture of him actually delivering mail to his wife, Anna, and children, Herbert, Lewis, and Margaret, at their home. And you can see the mailbox there that he is delivering on, because in a little bit I will discuss the changes in mailbox that resulted from rural free delivery. Then we have Frank Sendelbach. So in 1914, he started working for the Postal Service. He was a rural and city carrier, and he also worked as a dispatch and window clerk, and eventually was assistant postmaster here in Pipestone for 7 years. And there he is in the photo. And so they were both involved with the Minnesota Rural Letter Carriers Association, and in 1917, they held their convention in Pipestone here. So it was held July 13th and 14th, and the officers arrived the 12th and held their executive board meeting that night at the Calumet. They opened the convention the next day. 75 carriers were present at the opening session, and about 50 were delegates from throughout the state. And both Frank Sendelbach and Henry Petchow attended. And so there's a couple County Star newspaper articles. State Convention of Carriers is opened right the day it opened, and then the week after they ran another article about how they had a successful meeting here. So the first general meeting was held at the courthouse at 8 a.m. There was a reception by the Southwestern Minnesota Rural Letter Carriers Association, and Henry Petchow, who was on the executive board and chairman of the Committee of Arrangements, called to order the meeting and gave the presentation speech where a Pipestone gavel was presented to the association state president, George Rose of Mankato. And after the first meeting, they all gathered out in front of the courthouse and took a group photo there, which is the photo on the board. And the Star reported, since it was held on Friday, July 13th, that the doings of the convention have been running like clockwork today in spite of the fact that it is Friday the 13th. So I thought that was just a little funny that they commented on that. So I'll finish up here with the impacts of rural free delivery. So it helped drive road improvements. There was a good roads movement going on at that time already, but this really spurred it as the post office was big on having passable roads, like I mentioned. So from 1896 to 1908, it was estimated that $70 million was spent on rural road repair and building. So rural residents, farmers really jumped on board and improved their roads so that they could get rural free delivery. And so that was a benefit throughout the entire country. It also led to standardized mailboxes. When rural delivery first started, you would see farmers, residents use everything from lard pails, syrup cans, apple, soap, and cigar boxes. And the carriers didn't really like that because some of them weren't big enough for the mail. They were too big. They were also all at different heights, so they'd have to get off the horse to put the mail in whatever item they were using. I read somewhere that some of the syrup pails weren't cleaned out, so they'd put the mail in there and get syrup on the mail. So the post office and the carriers wanted mailboxes standardized. So they put that out there. They got a bunch of submissions into the post office, and the one they landed on was a metal 6 by 8 by 18-inch mailbox. It was constructed to be fastened on a post at a convenient height for the carrier, and the boxes could be square, oblong, circular, or semicircular, but had to protect mail from rain, snow, and dust. And the familiar tunnel box design that most people think of with mailboxes was created by Roy Jorlman, who was a post office department engineer. One other thing that happened because of rural free delivery was post offices did decrease. In 1901, there were 76,945 post offices, which was the highest number there ever was in the country. By 1902, so just a year later, there was already around 1,000 fewer than that. And so in 2023, there were 31,132 post offices. And the most recent numbers I could find on rural carriers today, because obviously there are still rural carriers that deliver the mail. In 2022, there were 80,000 rural delivery routes in the United States, and they had 133,000 rural carriers still in employment with the post office. So that is my talk on rural free delivery. Thanks for coming.
It's interesting.
Yes.
That picture of, that one.
Yeah.
I see they have women there. Were they rural carriers too?
So in the beginning days of, I'm not sure specifically what these women were involved with. When they first started rural carriers, it was only a male profession. It did kind of expand. First it started that usually you would see women be substitute carriers for, their husband, their father, their brother. And then it expanded out to there that they did allow women to become carriers. So this was 1917, so I'm not sure when they started that, but it's possible by then they were allowed. They also could have worked at the post office, here in town doing another job and were involved with the convention.
I saw something interesting on Facebook for what that's worth. You can decide if you believe it or not, but and I don't remember a year on this, that you could mail kids, people.
Yes, I did.
You saw that?
I saw that while I was doing some research. I couldn't see how widespread it was, because I've seen that on Facebook too, that they made it seem like it was kind of a big thing. And while I was doing this research, they did acknowledge that it happened, but they kind of made it seem like it was rarer than you would think. I saw one in the early days of rural free delivery that they literally just sent the kid like 2 miles to the grandparents' house. But I did see another one where they put the kid on the mail train because it was cheaper. They put postage on them, and it was cheaper than buying a train ticket.
It said something about one kid went 700 miles for 15 cents. And they showed a picture of 2 or 3 little boys, and they had stamps, big stamps on their chests, getting off a train.
And I saw you had, they inspected the routes.
Yes.
So here where we live, everybody has a mailbox at the end of their driveway.
Yep.
But if you go further west, especially into Montana and Wyoming, you will find a little wide spot in the road that maybe has a store, and either in the store they'll have a little bank of mailboxes, or there may be several mailboxes in a row.
Yep.
Because those roads out there are not passable. So they have rural delivery, but not to their house.
Yeah. Yep, that is a good point.
Yeah, those roads are gumbo.
Well, having them all, the rural and the people in town, they had to pay for all their expenses to deliver the mail. They got a set salary, right?
Yes, the rural carriers. The city carriers, back then most of them would have walked, but when they started getting vehicles, they got post office department vehicles.
That's what I was gonna say.
And the rural carriers were still primarily, even today, they still primarily use their own personal vehicle. They get like a maintenance stipend now.
From the rural, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think
But
they
they
get
are
a mileage
compensated.
fee or something.
Yeah.
They're compensated, yeah.
That's why you see most mailmen that still deliver rural mail, they're not the shiniest vehicles.
Well, they know they're gonna wear them out.
They want
They're
a
already
good
well off.
vehicle, but an expensive vehicle doesn't make them any money.
Right.
Thanks for coming. Have a good day, everyone.
Yeah.